Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the evolutionary approach to personality. Since human beings have evolved over many different millennia, it makes sense that some of the ways in which human beings act might be adaptive towards the environment around them. If human beings have, for instance, something like social anxiety or some personality trait like aggressiveness, then maybe it was the case that maybe nowadays, or maybe back in the day, that at some point in time it was adaptive. All right, it helped the survival of our species. So maybe we can find some interesting answers as to why human beings are the way that they are based off of our evolutionary past. Okay, anytime we do this, we can't actually time travel and go back in time to figure out what were the selective pressures for human beings millennia ago, but we can kind of infer maybe what the selective pressures are and might gain some insight as to why human beings behave and think the way that they do. So the first thing that we want to discuss is evolution by natural selection. This is a topic that isn't controversial, isn't nearly as controversial today as it was 50 years ago, as it was even a decade or so ago. I remember in high school when I was in biology class that my teacher did not believe and didn't want to teach anything about evolution by natural selection, which is odd, especially for a biologist or someone teaching biology, especially someone that's teaching biology AP, which would hopefully, if you pass the test, give college credit. So, but even before then, I mean, that was the early-ish 2000s. But sometimes, for some people, natural selection or evolution by natural selection puts a bad taste in their mouth. But it's not nearly as controversial today as it once was, and pretty much all of biology makes sense in light of natural selection. Every biologist nowadays would agree with Darwin's idea of natural selection. So let's talk a little bit about the logic of natural selection. We're going to frame this in the way that Darwin did in terms of a logical argument. So I'll give you some premises, and if all of these premises happen to be true, then the logical conclusion has to be true. So if we can agree on these premises, then there is a logical conclusion, and that logical conclusion is that evolution by natural selection has to exist. So we're going to talk about 4 premises that underlie natural selection. All right, first premise. All these premises are going to be very hard to argue against in terms of modern biology and modern science. First premise is that of variation. Individuals within populations vary. All right, some people are tall, some people are short, some people have brown hair, some people have blonde hair, some people are agreeable, some people are not agreeable. There is a lot of variation within a particular species. All right, so there's a lot of variation within species. We can't really argue against that. It's pretty obvious. All right, our personalities differ, our intelligence differs, our physical characteristics, our muscle strength, all of that stuff differs, not just in humans, but in all species. Let me take, for instance, dogs or household pet dogs. A Saint Bernard is the same species as a Chihuahua, and there's a lot of variation between those two. All right, so there's a lot of variation within species. 2, this variation is passed on to the offspring. Okay, this is the principle of heritability. You probably look and act similar to the ways that your parents do. All right? You look, act, behave in similar ways to your parents. A lot of this variation is passed on from parent to offspring. Again, this is pretty evident. All right, we can see this by ourselves. We can see this by looking at twin studies. We can see this by looking at any animal that reproduces. 3, there are limited resources. All right, for birds, there are only so many places in which they can make their nest. There's only so much food. There are predators out there. There's always a competition for resources. All right, only so many members of a species can survive. Okay, there can't be unlimited birds because there are only so many trees. There's only so many worms for the birds to eat. All right, so there's competition, and that means that some individuals are going to survive because they're better able at finding worms, for instance, and some individuals are not going to survive. So there's a competition for limited resources. The last premise here is that of differential survival. Some of these variations within species lead a particular member of that species to be more likely to survive, to be more likely to reproduce. If you're a moth that blends in with trees, you're less likely to be eaten by a bird. However, if you are a moth with gaudy colors that a bird is able to see quite easily, you're more likely to be eaten. All right. Stronger deer are maybe more likely to survive. Faster deer are more likely to survive. All right. Some of these variations are more likely to lead to successful reproduction and successful survival. So if it's the case that there's limited resources, that there's variation that's passed on from parent to offspring, and that some of this variation leads people more likely to survive, it makes sense, or there's a logical conclusion to this, that certain traits are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Because some species are more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. Those traits are then passed on to the next generation, and those traits become more prevalent within the species. Right? That is the principle of natural selection. All right. So if all of these turn out to be true, all right, if all these premises are true, then it's the case that natural selection has to exist. And that's Darwin's argument here. All right, he proposed this argument in a very famous book called The Origin of Species. If you haven't read it, it's actually pretty good, published in 1859. So natural selection is the process in which organisms better adapted to their environment, survive and produce more offspring. So certain traits are more likely to be passed on to future generations. All right, let's look at some examples of this. Darwin, on his voyage of the Beagle, he traveled to a number of different islands, including the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin noticed that some of the finches on the islands, that their beaks were shaped in such a way to be advantageous for the food sources of those islands. So for instance, if the island had a lot of insects on the island, then the birds' beaks might have been curved so that they were able to get into the bark of trees and pick up those insects. However, if the food source on the island was nuts, and there were a lot of nuts, not a lot of insects, then the birds' beaks were shorter and more powerful, so that they were able to crush these nuts and eat them. If the major food source on the island was flowers, and the birds had to eat nectar, then their beaks developed to be longer, all right, so they could go inside the flower and get the nectar. So what Darwin argued is that at one point in time, all of these islands were together. And they were all together, and there was one species of finch. But as those islands drifted apart, and the food sources on the island changed, they were no longer able to get access to all of the food, well then only certain members of the species survived. If you were a finch that had a shorter beak that was more powerful, you're more likely to survive on the island that had nuts on it. And so your offspring were more likely to survive, and eventually over time, the beaks of the birds that lived on those islands were short and powerful. Whereas if the major food source on your island was insects, birds evolved to have beaks that might have been curved, and they were able to get under the bark and eat all the delicious insects. So that was Darwin's theory about what was going on with these finches, and people have come, or biologists have come after the fact to these islands and have shown that Darwin was correct about this. Let me give you one more example here with giraffes. All right. An old theory of evolution that was proposed by Lamarck stated that giraffes have long necks because, well, originally giraffes had short necks, and then they would stretch their necks out to try to get to the leaves on a tree. And since the father and mother had stretched their necks out some, they passed this on to their offspring, and their offspring had a slightly longer neck. And that offspring stretched their neck out to get the leaves of the tall trees, and eventually, over many different iterations, many different generations, there we go, the giraffes had a long neck. But Lamarck was incorrect about this. The way that Darwin, with his process of natural selection, would talk about giraffes having long necks. Well, giraffes have natural variation in the size of their necks, but only the giraffes with tall necks were able to get the leaves on the tall trees. So if you were a short-necked giraffe, you would die. And you would die and you would not produce offspring. So after many different generations of only the tall or the long-necked giraffes getting the leaves, then all of the giraffes that survived, all their offspring, had longer necks. All right, so that's how natural selection works. Fun facts about giraffes. Okay, well, I don't know if you know this, but let's just have some fun facts here. Giraffes, if you ever look at their heart's like massive. It's like very huge. It pumps a lot of blood. Why is their heart so large? Well, it turns out that if you're trying to pump blood all the way up to their neck, pumping it against gravity, you have to have a very powerful heart. And not only that, you have to have very, very high blood pressure, all right, to get that blood all the way to the giraffe's brain, up the giraffe's neck. You have to have very, very high blood pressure. So Romans back in the day occasionally would cut off the head of the giraffe, and blood would go spurting everywhere like a fountain because giraffes have such high blood pressure. Kind of a weird story, but I thought I'd share that with you nonetheless. All right, so moving on. So The Origin of Species is Darwin's most famous book, hands down. It's very important for biology. It is not Darwin's most important book for psychology, though. Darwin has a few books that are important for psychology, but one of those is called The Descent of Man, and this is published in 1871. Here's where Darwin talks specifically about the evolution of human beings and how we evolved from primates. But so he talks about that in the book. But another interesting thing is Darwin talks about a special instance of natural selection called sexual selection. Sexual selection is where a potential mate selects a partner based off of some characteristics that show that partner has good genes. And sexual selection explains a lot of odd cases or not survival-based adaptations that some organisms might have. So let me give you an example of this. Most famous example here, we're looking at peacocks. All right. So if I were to ask you which one's the male peacock, you know this. It's the more beautiful one. So this beautiful peacock with all these lovely tail feathers is the male. This one that is not nearly as colorful is the female. So why does the male look like this? It's not very advantageous because peacocks live in India, and something that loves to eat peacocks are tigers. Right? If you have a long tail, if you have a long train of tail feathers, tiger's more likely to catch you. All right, it's not very advantageous. So that's number one. Two, think about the amount of bodily resources you have to spend to create this beautiful tail and these vibrant colors. Instead of using this energy, or these metabolic resources to, I don't know, make muscle, used for energy to run away from tigers, you're using it to make tail feathers and to be brightly colored. Not a very good use if the only thing that you're trying to do is survive. But why is it the case that the male has these beautiful tail feathers? Well, if the male has survived and it can afford to waste a lot of its metabolic resources on these tail feathers and these vibrant colors, well then the peacock's probably pretty strong. It's probably pretty fast. So if the female peacock wants to have children that survive, children that are more likely to reproduce, it makes sense for her to mate with a male peacock that has the most vibrant colors, that has the most beautiful tail feathers. So this is an example of traits being selected for by sexual selection, right? A special type of natural selection. Another example here, we have some bucks. I was kind of going to combine deer and bucks and say ducks, but that's a completely different animal. Why do deer have these horns? Is it the case that it helps fend off like bears or something like that? Okay, not necessarily. All right, these bucks develop these horns as to compete with one another, okay, to assert dominance. All right, also a female deer is able to select a male deer that has good genes based off of if they're able to waste a lot of their metabolic resources and carry around all these dumb antlers. All right, these antlers also help competing against other males to show dominance, and if they are more dominant, the female knows that they have quote-unquote better genes and is more likely to mate with them. Last example here is my favorite one, one that you might not be familiar with. These are bowerbirds from, why do I want to say New Zealand or New Guinea? I'm blanking out on it, but there's someplace near Australia. All right, bowerbirds. We have the male here, very colorful, and the female not very colorful. That's typically what you see. Not all the time, but typically what you see. And the male bowerbird creates this thing called a bower. And this is not a nest. The female is not going to lay their eggs in this bower. The only purpose of this is to impress a female. So what a male bowerbird does is they create this straw hay-like structure, try to make it big and so that it looks good. Not only that, they collect a lot of pretty things. So they collect feathers, they collect insect shells, they collect flowers. Here's another example of a bower down here where we have lots of colorful objects. And they try to make it look as good as possible with all of these wonderful doodads that are colorful. And so what the male bowerbird would do is they will go to a female bowerbird and say, hey, come check out my crib. And they will fly back to their bower and show their bower off. And if the female likes what she sees, she will mate with the male bowerbird. If she doesn't, she leaves. All right, so the male bowerbird is showing how good his genes are based off of how well he constructs his bower and how many cool objects he has. If you're a male bowerbird and your bower doesn't look so good, one strategy that you might have is to go to your neighbor and steal all his beetles, steal all his flowers, and then kick his bower down. So you get rid of some of the competition that way. So then that's what we see with bowerbirds. All right, so sexual selection. Why do bowerbirds waste a lot of their time doing it? They're trying to show to the female bowerbirds that they have good genes and that you should mate with me because I have the intelligence and the capability of creating a large bower, and I have the energy to collect all of these dumb objects. At this point in time, I ask my class typically, do human beings, why do I talk about this? Do human beings behave in ways similar to bowerbirds? And inevitably someone will raise their hand and say, yeah, well, what happens when a guy is trying to show off his nice car or his nice house or all of these sort of things? They're doing something very similar. I have all of these cool things. I am able to accomplish things. You should mate with me because I have good genes. Maybe that's what's going on with human beings as well. We'll talk about that here with personality a little bit shortly. All right. So if we want to explain something about human beings in terms of why they think, feel, and behave the particular way that they do, and we use natural selection or the special case of sexual selection to explain it, we are in a subfield of psychology known as evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology really started developing in the 1990s. and has become quite a large field within psychology. Okay, evolutionary psychology, quite an interesting branch of psychology. So we're looking at trying to explain particular mental and psychological and behavioral traits as a function of natural and sexual selection. All right, so evolutionary psychology is quite controversial because, again, we can't time travel. We can't go way back in the day and see our ancestors and look at the selective pressures that they were under. We have to infer what those are. So some people have argued that we can't really learn anything useful from using an evolutionary perspective because we can't go back in time. We're making up stories after the fact. But it might be important to try to explain why human beings are the way that they are by at least thinking about what the selective pressures of human beings, or what the selective pressures of our ancestors. It might be important, and we might be able to explain some interesting things with human beings by looking at that. All right, so let's give a couple of examples here. Let's look at something that's unique to human beings. So let's look at social anxiety. So getting nervous about being in front of a large crowd of people. Now, the interesting thing about this is that being in front of a large crowd of people will not kill you. It might feel like you want to die, but it won't. All right? So if you were to ask high school Tyler, would you rather be in front of a ton of people and give a speech, or would you rather swim across a river filled with crocodiles? It would be a hard decision. I might go with the crocodiles, okay? Public speaking was very anxiety-provoking for me in high school. But why? Why is it the case that social anxiety exists? Why would it have evolved in human beings? Well, Roy Baumeister and Tice have come up with an explanation for this. Their explanation is that social anxiety has developed to prevent us from being socially excluded. Human beings are a very social species. How do we survive? We communicate with one another to find out where food sources are, okay, English. Find out where predators might be, okay, gain some information about how to create tools, get potential mates. All of these things require social interaction. But if we do things and say the wrong things, we might be socially excluded. We might not have no friends. And we don't have any friends, we're not going to find out how to make tools. We're not going to find out where the predators are. We're not going to find out where food sources are. We're not going to find a potential mate. Okay, so it makes sense that we have evolved something to prevent us from doing something that's very socially dumb, that we're likely to be socially excluded. So social anxiety lets us know, ooh, if I get up there and dance on the table, people are going to make fun of me, and they're not going to want to hang out with me later. So I probably shouldn't dance on that table. So that's why social anxiety might have developed in human beings. All right, one explanation. But with anything that's evolutionary, we can also come up with a non-evolutionary interpretation of the events. So for anything that we have an evolutionary explanation for, we have to be mindful that that isn't the only explanation. Maybe there is a non-evolutionary explanation for the particular outcome. All right, and we'll see that here with our next example. Who are we most likely to help out? Okay, the first thing that we're going to talk about is in terms of relationships. Okay, who is related to you? Are you most likely to help out someone that is your mother or father, or someone that you're completely unrelated to? Are you likely to help out your first cousin or your second cousin? So how related does the person have to be before you're willing to help them? And we're going to talk about two kinds of helping behaviors. First one is whether or not it's some like everyday kind of help. So can I bum $5 off of you? Are you likely to give that person that $5? Number two, how about a life or death situation? Who are you likely to go into a burning building and save? So let's look at relatedness. So we have everyday type help here with the red line, and the pink line is the life or death situation. We are most likely to help people that are highly related to us. Our children, our parents, all right, our brothers and sisters. We are likely to help, but to a lesser degree, our first cousins. And then it goes down to people that are unrelated to us. What's the evolutionary explanation of this? Well, your brother and your sister have DNA that's very similar to yours. So if you want to pass your genes into the future, you should help your family members because their genes are very similar to yours. Now, this is not consciously. It's not like you help your brother and you help your sister out and you're thinking, yeah, I really want to pass my genes on in the future. You don't think that. How about your first cousin? Well, they have some of the same genes that you have, so it makes sense that you would help them out, but maybe not to the same extent as your own children, perhaps. So that's the evolutionary explanation for this. How about a non-evolutionary explanation for this? Well, you know people that are related to you better than you know a complete stranger that's unrelated to you. So you're probably more likely to help people that are related, or you're more likely to help people that you know for a longer amount of time than people that you don't know. That's a non-evolutionary explanation of the same data. And we can't tease those two things apart. We can't tease those two interpretations away from one another just with one study here. Again, we can't go back in time and look at the selective pressures for our ancestors. All right, so this was how related someone is. Now let's look at age. All right, are you more likely to help baby? Are you more likely to help middle-aged person? Are you more likely to help grandma? All right, so think about that. Think about in terms of everyday situations or life or death. Who are you likely to go into a burning building for? Baby, teenager, middle-aged adult, grandma. Versus everyday kind of help. So bum $5 off of you. Well, for everyday kind of help, we're most likely to help children. Not children, babies. I mean, we are likely to help children. But we're most likely to help babies, most likely to help grandma. Okay, people that need help, we're more likely to help them for everyday kinds of situations. But in life or death situations, we're most likely to help babies. We're not likely to help grandma. All right? So if you were in, if a ship was sinking and you had a rowboat and you could only save one person, baby or grandma, you would save baby and you kick grandma off the boat. Why is this the case? An evolutionary approach would be grandma has already reproduced. Grandma has already had the children that she's going to have. So, bye-bye grandma. You have done your evolutionary duty. We salute you. Baby, on the other hand, has not developed, has not passed their offspring, or not passed their genes on. So baby's still got a lot of developing to do, and they have not done their evolutionary duty. So it makes sense to save baby, bye-bye grandma. All right, so we can have an evolutionary explanation for that fact. All right. Similarly, let's ask the following question. Which of your cousins are you most likely to help? All right, all of these are going to be your first cousins. And think about these four different situations. We have your mother's sister's kid. We have your mother's brother's kid, your father's sister's kid, and your father's brother's kid. All of those are your first cousins. Which are you most likely to help out? Are you likely to help out all of them equally? Are you more likely to help out one? Think about what you would do. All right, let me show you what the data suggests. The data suggests that you're likely to help out your mother's sister's children, those first cousins, much more likely than you are your father's brother's children. Why is this the case? So let's give the evolutionary explanation of this first. If you are a female, you are 100% certain that the kid is yours, right? The kid comes out of you, that's your kid, right? There's no chance that is not your kid. So your mother's sister's kid, you are 100% certain, or very certain, that that kid is related to you. So it makes sense to help them because they have similar genes than you. But your father's brother's kid, on the other hand, you are less likely to know who your true father is, right? You can never be 100% positive who's the father, except with genetic testing, obviously. And your father's brother, again, you're not 100% sure that your father's brother, that's their true kid. So you're less certain that they have the same genes as you. So it makes sense evolutionarily why you would help your mother's sister's kid at a higher degree than your father's brother's kid, because the certainty in which you are related to that first cousin. That's the evolutionary explanation for this. But again, we can weave another explanation. I shouldn't say mothers, women, females are more likely to stay close to their parents than men are. And that's just a social cultural thing. So your mother's sister is likely to be closer to her, and you're more likely to see those cousins compared to your father's brother's kids, right? Men are more likely to move away from the family compared to females. So we might get this relationship solely because people know their mother's sister's children better than their father's brother's children. So we might find that this finding that way as well, give a social cultural explanation as opposed to an evolutionary explanation. All right. So that might explain some of the ways that human beings behave the way that they do. Maybe explain some of the reasons why human beings have the personality traits that they do. Now let's move on to talk about sex differences. Differences in personality. Here we're going to talk about personality and behavior between males and females. All right. When I was in animal behavior in undergrad, I had a wonderful professor, Dr. John Batson. And John Batson had a catchy way of summing up all sex differences between males and females in psychology. And his catchy way of describing this was that eggs are expensive, sperm are cheap. And if you can remember that, you can explain all of the differences between males and females. All right. What do we mean by eggs are expensive and sperm are cheap? All right. For a female, they are born with all of the eggs that they will have in their entire life. All right. As soon as a female is born, they have all the eggs that they're ever going to produce. They have a 9-month gestation period. All right. It takes 9 months from impregnation to delivering the baby. Not only that, women undergo menopause and are unable to produce any offspring around the age of 50. So females can only produce so many children. An optimal reproduction strategy for females is to take good care of the few children that you can have, to make sure that you select a mate who's going to be awesome and do a good job taking care of the kids, to select a mate that has very good genes so that your children are more likely to survive, more likely to thrive in life. So that's a strategy. If you want to get your genetic material into the future generations, if you are a female, that's what you should do. That's the optimal strategy. Eggs are expensive. There's only so many of them, right? Now, how about if you're a guy? How about if you're a male? All right? Males produce a near infinite amount of sperm, all right? They produce trillions and trillions and trillions of sperm. They can impregnate multiple women at the same time. So instead of having one kid at a time, well, except for twins and octuplets and things like that, but those are atypical. Men can have virtually infinite amount of children all at the same time. And a male never really stops producing sperm. A male can continue to have children in their 80s or 90s. So if you're a male, and again, not ethically, but evolutionarily, your goal is to produce as many offspring as possible to get your genes into the future as much as possible. What is the optimal strategy? And it's to mate with everything. You mate with everything. That is the optimal strategy for a guy to get their genes into the future as much as possible. Again, not the ethical thing to do. All right, we would not like that nowadays in terms of ethics. But Evolutionarily, that might be the pressure in which men are under compared to the pressure in which females are under. So if we remember eggs are expensive and sperm are cheap, we can explain why men behave the way that they do differently than the way that women behave. So let me explain a study to demonstrate this, one by Clark and Hartfield. Okay, give me one. All right, so this study was conducted at Florida State University. There were two important independent variables. First of all was the independent variable of, well, not really manipulated, but acts as an independent variable, that of the subject. So the subject was either male or female. And an attractive confederate here being someone that is in cahoots with the experimenter, that is an actor, goes up to a member of the opposite sex and ask them one of three questions. They start off, I've been noticing you at this party. Oh, well, I should mention that this is at like a college party type thing. So the attractive member of the opposite sex comes up to the subject and says, hey, I've been noticing you across the room, and I was just wondering if you wanted to. One of three questions. This was the other independent variable. Do you want to go out on a date with me? A little bit creepy approach, but not too terribly bad. So that's one, go on a date with me. Go back to my apartment. It's a little bit more forward, all right? And last one, go to bed with me. Very, very forward. So the dependent variable of this study was whether or not the subject said, yes, I agreed to this. And of course, if they said yes or no, the person was like, just joshing, this is a psychology experiment, so sorry to get your hopes up. But that is the study. Okay. First, let's look at what happens if the attractive male confederate goes up to the female. All right. What is the probability that the person will say yes? Going on a date with me, about 50% said yes. Go back to my apartment, virtually no one. Go to bed with me, absolutely no one, 0. So this is what we see for female subjects. What do you predict is going to happen when we look at male subjects? With male subjects, do you want to go on a date with me? It's about 50%. Go back to my apartment, higher than that. Go back to bed with me, even higher than that. So we get the opposite pattern of results here for males. Why is this the case? First, let's give our evolutionary explanation. Eggs are expensive. All right, who should you mate with as a female? Someone that has good genes that you are sure is going to be invested in taking care of the child. Someone you met one time at a party, not necessarily that. So as soon as the intentions of the confederate are clear, then you're going to say no, right? But for guys, for males, sperm are cheap. Right? The ideal mating situation, the ideal way of getting your genes into the future is to mate with absolutely everything. So we see that guys are more likely to say yes, the clearer it is the chance for sex. All right, so that's the evolutionary explanation of this difference in behavior, the sex difference. But we could do a social cultural explanation as well. All right, one time in class someone said, well, the risk of sexual violence is much higher for females than it is for males, and so they don't know who they are going to have sex with. So maybe it's the case that we see this pattern of results because of that. Also, there is social culturally, it is more permissible for a guy to have sex before marriage than for females. Right? It's okay for the guy to have tons of sex. It's not okay for the woman to have tons of sex. That conception, that cultural idea has changed definitely. And in fact, we can conduct this study nowadays and we see a pattern of results actually similar to males up here for both males and females. This sex difference actually goes away with today's society. So it might not be an evolutionary explanation for this pattern of results in 1989. All right, so that is a potential evolutionary explanation of this pattern of results. Let's look at some other differences in mate preference. Here's a study by Kenrick and colleagues, and we're asking people what is the minimum acceptable intelligence for you to date a person, have sex with that person, steady dating. This is a very old school term. This is essentially dating that person and no one else. And marrying that person. What's the minimal acceptable intelligence? For females, it increases linearly. All right, to date somebody, they have to be about average intelligence. To have sex with them, a little bit above average, and then it goes up. For men, on the other hand, sperm are cheap. Date, well, I want you to be average intelligence. Boom, have sex with, doesn't matter if you're dumb. And it goes back up to the same. So the only sex difference here is in having sex. Again, we might weave an evolutionary explanation of this. Sperm are cheap, mate with everything. All right, let's look at another one. Let's look at minimum acceptable earning capacity. Again, we ask the same questions, but how much money does the person make before you date them, have sex with them, steady date them, and marry them? We see a huge sex difference here between males and females, all right, where females care about the earning capacity of the male, whereas males do not. This could be an evolutionary reason. Could be the case that, again, eggs are expensive. It makes sense for women to be more choosy about their mate and that their mate is able to take care of the offspring, right? Guys, doesn't matter if that child actually survives. You can have infinite numbers of children. So the earning capacity of your female counterpart doesn't necessarily matter. Again, this could be cultural as well, right? Culturally, but this research, I think it was 1993. So I wonder if this sex difference would go away nowadays, or at least, be attenuated. Culturally, the man is supposed to bring home the bread and the wife is supposed to take care of the children. That's a very traditional gender norms. But maybe some people have these traditional gender norms that are taking this, and so we could have a social cultural explanation for these data as well. All right, some more. This is from Buss and Smith in 1993. Here is the number of sexual partners that you would like to have in the next month. 6 months, 1 year, all the way to life. Males, the number of sex partners is much higher than it is for females. Again, you might have an evolutionary explanation for this. Sperm are cheap, eggs are expensive. We can also look at some similar data in the amount of time that you know somebody. What's the probability that you will have sex with that person? Knowing a person for 5 years, males and females are equally likely to have sex with that person. However, after that, the difference is quite large. So knowing for someone for an hour, males still likely to have sex with that person, females not likely at all. So the amount of time that you know somebody to have sex with them is different for males and females. All right, so we can explain some things maybe in terms of evolution, the selective pressures that males and females are under. Let's talk about two major sex differences here, not in reproductive behavior, but in personality. The largest sex difference in personality is that of aggression. Males are much more likely to be aggressive than females. Now, it does depend on the type of aggression. So perhaps in social psychology, you've learned about males are more likely to be physically aggressive. Females are more likely to be to commit relational aggression. But overall aggression, males are much more likely to be aggressive than females. Not only that, males are more likely to kill and murder other males. Okay, there's a lot of male-on-male violence. In one of the first studies of evolutionary psychology, this is by Daly and Wilson in 1988, they looked at the number of murders committed in Chicago from 1965 to 1980. The vast majority of those, 86%, were committed by men. And of these 86%, the vast majority of the 80%, the victims were males. So a lot of male-on-male violence. Why is it the case that men are so much more aggressive, at least physically aggressive, compared to women? We can look at this. It doesn't seem to necessarily be cultural because we see this across many, many different cultures. Doesn't matter if we're looking here in Western societies like the United States of America, if we're looking at Eastern societies like that of Japan or China, male aggression is always larger than female aggression. Why is this the case? To explain this, I'm going to go off on a tangent. And you're going to think that I have lost my mind and that I'm talking about something that in no way is going to be relevant. But it is going to be relevant, so trust me. So we're going to talk a little bit about primates. And it's going to help us figure out why male humans are more aggressive than female humans. Okay, so let's take a detour and talk about some primates. Here we have a male gorilla. Look at how massive this thing is. If you've never seen one of these in real life, you need to. They are massive, very, very powerful. Chimpanzees too. Chimpanzees are much more powerful than you think they're going to be. Here we have a female gorilla. It is very easy to tell the male gorilla from the female gorilla. The male gorilla is much larger than the female gorilla. All right, here we've got a comparison of the two. This difference is known as sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is the amount of difference in appearance, particularly size, between the males and females of a species, not counting their sex organs. Obviously, their sex organs are going to be different. But here we're looking at the size. Male gorillas weigh about 4 times as much as female gorillas, something like that. They weigh a whole lot more. They're very, very powerful. All right, why is this the case? What does this tell us particularly about male gorillas? In species that have a lot of sexual dimorphism, particularly in which the male is much larger than the female, these have a mating pattern typically of that of a tournament species. Okay, a tournament species is a species of animals in which there is a hierarchy among one of these sexes. Typically it's the males, although there are some tournament species where the female is dominant. So with a tournament species, there is an alpha male, and the alpha male is able to have sex and procreate with all of the females. Okay, it doesn't matter if we're looking at a troop of gorillas. I think troop is the right term there. Or lions, doesn't matter. The alpha male is able to have children with all of the females. If you are lower than the alpha male, you are not going to have any children, or you're very unlikely to have children. So there's a lot of variability in the number of offspring that you have. If you're a very dominant, very powerful male, you become the alpha male, you have all the children. If you are not the most powerful male of your group, you have none of the children. All right, so there's a lot of competition among men. For tournament species, it makes sense for the males to be bulky. It makes sense for them to be hyper-aggressive, or otherwise, they're not going to have any children. So there's some selection for males to be bigger, to be more powerful, to be stronger, to be aggressive. Otherwise, they're not going to be the alpha male. We see this pattern in lions. All right. So this tells us something very interesting about Lion King. So why does Scar kill Mufasa? Well, he wants to have access to all the females of the pride. It also tells you something very interesting about Simba and Nala. Okay, Simba and Nala are from the same pride. That means that their father is probably the same, and that makes things a little bit gross. So think about that next time you watch The Lion King. Another great example of a tournament species, we have elephant seals. Elephant seals, the male elephant seal is massive. I forget how much more an elephant seal weighs compared to the female, but they are massive. All right, we see a lot of sexual dimorphism here. The male elephant seal is able to mate with all of the females, have all the children, and if you are a slightly less large elephant seal, the alpha male will run you off. All right, so that is tournament species. It makes sense that sexual dimorphism is selected for, that males are more bulky, because otherwise they're not going to have any children. All right, so let's look at gibbons. If I were to tell you, ask you which one's the male and which one's the female, you might not be able to do this. Of course, the coloration is different, but the size is relatively the same. There's a little bit of sexual dimorphism, not very much. All right, I believe this is the male gibbon and this is the female gibbon. This is an example of a pair bonding species. Pair bonding species is a species in which one male mates with one female and they take care of the child together. They take care of the offspring together. All right. For a pair bonding species, these animals are relatively monogamous. I mean, there's some cheating going on with gibbons, but not as much variability in how many offspring that you have compared to gorillas or tournament species. So if there is some infidelity among gibbons, you know what that means? That means that they're swingers. Ha 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 ha. That's the best joke in the entire class. And I'm very sad I had to give it to you via Zoom as opposed to in person, because I love to hear the groans. Okay, so pair bonding species. Not that much sexual dimorphism. They're not very aggressive. They don't need to be aggressive. They don't need to compete for access to females, the males, that is. All right, you can see many examples of pair bonding species. All right. Here are some gnats. Which one's the male, which one's the female? I don't know. They look exactly the same. All right. No sexual dimorphism, or very little sexual dimorphism. Evidence of a pair bonded species, we don't see an increased amount of aggression in male gnats. Here we have voles. Voles are interesting because they're actually the way neuroscientists study monogamy. Interestingly enough, the hormones of monogamy, being in a committed relationship, a lot of interesting research with voles. If I were to remove the pups, because obviously you can tell this is the female and this is the male, there's not much sexual dimorphism. You couldn't tell who's the male and who's the female. Evidence of pair bonding species. They work together, take care of the children together. Males have equal numbers of children to one another. There's not as much variability in how many offspring that you have like there is with gorillas and other tournament species. So what does this have to do with human aggression? Is there sexual dimorphism in human beings? Well, a little bit. There is some, not zero. Men are roughly 12% larger than females, so not as different as elephant seals or gorillas, but there is some. Does this mean that human beings, oh, let me back up. Are we a tournament species or a pair bonding species? Well, culturally, we tend to be a pair bonding species, but evolutionarily, many millennia ago, what were we? Well, it turns out that with the amount of sexual dimorphism that we have throughout our evolutionary history, we're a mix between a tournament and a pair bonding species. Because of that competition for access to mates, male humans have evolved to be more aggressive. More aggressive males are more likely to have access to females, at least evolutionarily speaking, at least in our evolutionary past. Nowadays, not so much. Culturally, we are very different, but maybe the evolutionary pressures of our ancestors back in the day have led males to be more aggressive. Okay, so an evolutionary psychologist would argue that men have higher levels of aggression than women because aggression helped men in our evolutionary history compete with other men for access of potential mates. That's the evolutionary explanation of increased male aggression. All right, let's look at one more major sex difference here in personality. Let's look at differences in jealousy. I love to ask my class, who's more jealous, males or females? Because I always get very interesting questions or very interesting answers to this question. Well, the answer is, as you probably guessed, it depends. But what does it depend on? Let me give you a following two situations, and it's your job to tell me which of these is worse. Okay, both of these situations are not going to be pleasant. You don't want them to happen to you. But which one of them would you rate as being worse? All right. So here's the prompt. Think of a serious committed relationship that you've had in the past, that you currently have, or one that you would like to have. Imagine that you discover that the person with whom you've been seriously involved with has become interested in someone else. Of the following, which would distress you more? Again, both of these are going to be bad. Which one of them is more distressing? Imagining your partner forming a deep emotional attachment to that person that they are cheating on you with, or imagining that person enjoying passionate sexual intercourse with somebody other than you. Which one of those is worse? Now, both of those is bad. Both of those are bad. But what we see is that males are more likely to rate the sexual intercourse as being more distressing, whereas females are more likely to rate the deep emotional attachment to somebody else as more distressing. And we see this sex difference not just with people in the United States of America. We see this all across the world, in South Korea, in Germany, in the Netherlands. We find this sex difference in many different cultures. So why is this the case? Another thing, males, if they're told that they've been cheated on, they're more likely to inquire on the sexual nature of the cheating episode. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to inquire about the emotional aspects of the cheating, okay, the emotional nature of the cheating incident. So why the sex differences in jealousy? Well, women are quite sure that the offspring are theirs. But what they care about is whether or not the male is going to be invested in raising the child, if they're going to provide resources for the child. So it makes sense that the female cares about whether or not this was a one-time incident that they're not emotionally connected to, because as long as they are maybe having sex, but still going to come back to them, that is less concerning. Still concerning, but less concerning, evolutionarily. All right? Because again, they know that the child is their own. They are more concerned in the resources and taking care of the child. Men, on the other hand, are never 100% sure that children are their own. So they're going to be more cautious of the sexual relationships that their female partners are going to have for heterosexual relationships. All right. Males care about whether or not the offspring is theirs. That's why they rate this as more distressing. All right. So again, evolutionary explanation for this. So maybe it's the case that evolutionary perspective and personality can give us some insights as to why humans behave the way that they do. All right. Have a great day, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Thank you, and bye-bye.